The ink on the new pages was still wet, a dark, glistening smudge that smelled of chemical spirits and indifference. It was 3 in the afternoon, but inside the windowless cavern of Stage 4, time had ceased to hold any authority. The only thing that mattered was the light, the brutal, uncompromising arc lamps that hung like mechanical vultures in the rafters, waiting to feed on the woman sitting before the vanity mirror. Marilyn sat perfectly still. To the makeup artist hovering behind her with a powder puff, she looked like a porcelain doll waiting for the final glaze. Her hair was a sculpted halo of platinum spun sugar, dipped with hairspray, catching the light in a way that seemed to generate its own electricity. Her lips were painted that specific, impossible shade of red that the studio chemists had mixed solely for her, a color designed to signal availability and danger in equal measure. But behind the blue-gray eyes, beneath the layers of Max Factor foundation that masked the pale exhaustion of her skin, a tectonic plate was shifting. She looked down at the script, pages that had been thrust into her hands 10 minutes ago by a breathless assistant director. They were pink. Revision pages always were. Pink meant change. Pink meant that the scene she had spent 3 weeks memorizing, the scene where her character finally explained the sorrow behind her laughter, had been cut. In its place was a pratfall. The scene now required her to trip over a poodle, lose her skirt, and giggle while a room full of men in gray suits stared at her lingerie. The dialogue, which had once been a fragile confession of loneliness, was now reduced to 3 words. Oops, silly me. The silence in the dressing room was thick, textured by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the corrugated metal roof of the soundstage high above. It was a rare Los Angeles downpour, the kind that turned the studio lot into a gray, muddy reflection of the city's concrete soul. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of stale tobacco, hot bulbs, and the cloying sweetness of the gardenias someone had sent her that morning, flowers that were already beginning to brown at the edges. Arthur Vance, the producer of the Gilded Cage, stood in the doorway. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and expensive wool, holding a cigar that had gone out long ago. He watched her reflection in the mirror, not making eye contact with the real woman, only with the image. That was how it always was. They fell in love with the reflection, negotiated with the reflection, and sold the reflection. The woman in the chair was merely the inconvenient vessel that carried it. It's just a tweak, darling, Vance said, his voice smooth, like I eat your oil pouring over gravel. The test audiences, they got restless during the monologue. They don't want to see you cry. They pay to see you sparkle. You're the champagne, Marilyn. Nobody wants flat champagne. Marilyn's fingers tightened around the pink pages. The paper crinkled, a sound violent in the quiet room. She didn't turn around. She stared at herself, seeing the fracture between the person she was, Norma Jean, who read Rilke, and underlined passages about the terrifying nature of beauty, and the creature in the mirror. This creature was a suit of armor made of flesh and light. It protected her, but today it felt like it was suffocating her. I was promised, she whispered. Her voice was the famous whisper, breathy and childlike, but the underlying tone was different today. It was deeper, vibrating with a frequency that Boissier, in his arrogance, failed to register. You promised me that this one would be different, that she would have a soul. Vance laughed, a short, dismissive bark. He stepped into the room, encroaching on her space, the smell of his cologne overpowering the gardenias. Honey, souls don't sell. Popcorn, legs do, smiles do. Now, come on. The crew is on the clock egg. Put on the smile. Put on the dress. Be the girl everyone loves. He reached and patted Habanero's shoulder. It was a proprietary touch, the way a man pats the hood of a car he owns. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the door open, letting in the cold draft from the hallway and the murmur of 50 men waiting for her to come out and fall down for their amusement. Marilyn looked back at the script. Oops, silly me. The betrayal wasn't the script change. The betrayal was the assumption that she wouldn't notice, that she wouldn't care, that she was too vacant to understand that they were stripping the dignity from her work piece by piece. They thought the mask she wore was her face. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the pink pages on the vanity table. She picked up a heavy crystal ashtray, seeing her distorted reflection in the glass. For a second, her hand trembled, and the makeup artist flinched, expecting her to throw it. Instead, Marilyn set the ashtray down on top of the script, anchoring it. She opened the drawer of her vanity and pulled out something she had hidden beneath a box of tissues. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, battered and stained with coffee. She opened it to a fresh page. Her hand didn't shake as she picked up a pen. She wasn't going to the set. Not yet. The world outside believed she was late because she was difficult, because she was unstable, because she was lost in a fog of pills and insecurity. They wrote headlines about her tardiness, but they never asked what she was doing in those stolen minutes. She wrote a single sentence in the notebook, this tip of the pen digging deep into the paper. It was a promise to herself, a terrifying declaration of war against the machine that had made her. If I am to be a product, she wrote, then I will be the one who sets the price. She closed the book and looked up. The mirror stared back, but the fear in the eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, glittering resolve. The studio wanted a scene. She was about to give them one they hadn't written. The silence on the soundstage had curdled into resentment. 40 minutes had passed since the call time, and the crew stood in clusters within the shadows of the rigging, their whispers creating a low, restless hum that competed with the buzzing of the arc lights. The set was a masterclass in artificial joy, a bright pastel living room with oversized furniture and cheerful curtains that masked the blackened walls of the hangar beyond. It was a candy-colored cage waiting for its bird. Arthur Vance paced near the camera dolly, his shoes clicking sharply on the concrete floor, checking his watch with a theatrical aggression meant to be seen by everyone. Every minute the cameras weren't rolling burned thousands of dollars, a fact he intended to hang over Marilyn's head the moment she appeared. When she finally emerged from the darkness of the corridor, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't just an entrance, it was a physical change in air pressure. She walked toward the lit set with a gliding, precarious grace, her body encased in the silk dress that had been tailored so tightly she could barely draw a full breath. The crew fell silent, not out of respect, but out of the sheer magnetic pull of the creature she had manufactured. She stopped at the edge of the carpet, the lights hitting her with the force of a physical blow. To the electricians up in the gantries, she looked radiant, a creature made of light. But to the script supervisor standing just feet away, she looked like a woman walking to the gallows. The director, a man named Harrow who wore his cynicism like a badge of honor, stepped forward. He didn't ask where she had been. He didn't ask how she was. He simply pointed to the poodle, which was currently chewing on the leg of a prop table. "All right, Marilyn, you know the drill," Harrow barked, his voice echoing in the vast space. "You enter stage left, you see the dog, you get flustered. You trip over the ottoman, the skirt flies up. Give us a little, not too much, just enough to tease, and then you land. Look at the camera, big eyes, big smile, and say the line. Oops, silly me. Simple. Let's get it in one, we're losing the day." Marilyn nodded, her movements stiff. The disconnect between her mind and her body was widening, a chasm that was becoming impossible to bridge. Inside, Norma Jean was screaming that she was an actress, that she had studied with the greats, that she understood the human condition. But the woman standing on the mark was a puppet, her strings pulled by men who saw her only as a collection of parts: lips, hips, legs, chest. She closed her eyes for a brief second, inhaling the smell of the set, sawdust, hot gel filters, and the acrid sweat of 50 men watching her. She summoned the persona. She flipped the internal switch that turned the fear into a breathless, wide-eyed vulnerability. Action, Harrow yelled. She stepped onto the set. The lights were blinding, white-hot suns that offered no warmth. She saw the dog. She saw the ottoman. Her body moved through the choreography of clumsiness. She feigned the surprise, the wobble. She tripped. But as she fell, something fractured. Instead of the light, buoyant tumble of a comedienne, she hit the floor with a heavy, jarring thud. It wasn't funny, it was violent. Her skirt flared up, exposing her legs, but she didn't giggle. She lay there on the synthetic carpet for a beat too long, her breath hitching in her throat, her eyes wide, not with performance, but with a sudden, terrifying paralysis. Cut! Harrow threw his script down. Jesus, Marilyn, it's a comedy, not a tragedy. You fell like a sack of potatoes. Where's the sparkle? Where's the fun? You're supposed to be cute, not whatever that was. Do it again. And smile, for God's sake. She pushed herself up, her knees bruising against the hard floor. The makeup artist rushed in to powder her nose, whispering empty platitudes, but Marilyn didn't hear them. The humiliation was a cold fluid in her veins. They didn't want her reality. They wanted the caricature. They wanted the doll to bounce when dropped, not to break. She looked at Vance in the shadows. He was checking his watch again. He didn't care that she had hurt herself. He only cared that the take was unusable. Again, she whispered, her voice barely audible. They reset the scene. The bell rang. Action! This time, she gave them exactly what they wanted, but she pushed it to the edge of madness. She tripped, she fell, and she unleashed a giggle that was so high-pitched, so brittle, it sounded like crystal shattering in a canyon. She delivered the line, "Oops, silly me," with a smile so wide it looked painful, her eyes vacant and dead behind the lashes. Cut! Print it! That's the go! Harrow shouted, satisfied with the surface, blind to the scream beneath it. The crew began to move, preparing for the next setup, dismissing her as easily as they would a prop that had served its function. Marilyn retreated to the edge of the set, trembling. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold sweat and a profound sense of isolation. She felt the gaze of the studio publicist, a hawk-eyed woman named Clara, watching her from the sidelines. Clara wasn't there to protect Marilyn. She was there to contain her. Clara's job was to ensure that the cracks in the mask never reached the gossip columns. She approached Marilyn now, holding a small paper cup with 2 pills inside. "You look tired, honey," Clara said, her pitch sweet and poisonous. "Take these. They'll help you get through the afternoon. We have the photo shoot for Life magazine at 6. Marilyn looked at the pills, the uppers to work, the downers to sleep, the chemical cycle that kept the machine running. She took the cup, her fingers brushing Clara's cold hand. She didn't swallow them immediately. She held them in her palm, feeling their hard edges. A rebellion was brewing in her blood, fueled by the indignity of the pratfall, by the erasure of her voice. She realized then that if she didn't stop the machine, it would grind her down until there was nothing left but the celluloid image. Dancing forever while the woman died. She turned and walked away from the set, ignoring Harrow's call for a close-up. She walked past the cameras, past the lights, past the hovering publicist. She pushed open the heavy soundproof door and stepped out into the alleyway. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and black, reflecting the neon sign of the studio commissary. She stood there, shivering in the cool air, the pills clenched in her fist. She wasn't just tired, she was disappearing. And for the first time in her life, the terror of disappearing was outweighed by the rage of being erased. She looked at the phone booth near the security gate. She needed to make a call, not to a lover, not to an agent, but to the one person the studio had explicitly forbidden her to speak to, a journalist who had once written that Marilyn Monroe had the saddest eyes in Hollywood. She walked toward the booth, her heels clicking a rhythm of defiance. The cracks in the mic were no longer hairline fractures, they were gaping wounds, and she was about to stick her fingers in them and tear the whole thing apart. The phone booth was a glass coffin standing upright in the drizzle. It smelled of wet wool and the metallic tang of old copper pennies. Marilyn pressed the receiver against her ear, the black plastic cold against her flushed skin. Outside, the studio lot was a blurring watercolor of grays and muted yellows, distorted by the rain sliding down the glass. She felt exposed, a tropical bird trapped in a storm. Yet for the first time in years, she was the one holding the line. She was the one dialing the numbers. She didn't call her agent. She didn't call the studio doctor. She dialed a number she had memorized from a slip of paper passed to her at a premiere 3 years ago, a number belonging to Elias Thorne, a writer who had been blacklisted from the major tabloids for refusing to print a studio-fabricated scandal about an ingenue who had later taken her own life. Thorne wrote about the industry with the weary precision of a coroner. He didn't care about the glitter. He cared about the bodies buried beneath it. Thorne, a voice rasped on the other end, sounding like it had been dragged through gravel. It's me, Marilyn whispered. She didn't need to say her name. The whisper was a fingerprint. There was a long silence on the line, heavy with the weight of the unsaid. You shouldn't be calling this number, Marilyn. Vance finds out, he'll have my typewriter smashed and your contract suspended. I don't care about the contract, Elias. I have something that isn't pink. Her hand went to her pocket, touching the leather-bound notebook. It felt hot, radioactive. I need you to meet me. Not at the usual places. Somewhere they won't look. The Formosa is too loud. The Brown Derby is a shark tank, Thorne muttered, his tone shifting from wary to professional. Go to the observatory, the back lot, the old overlook, midnight, and Marilyn, come alone. If I see a handler, I'm gone. The hours between the call and midnight were a fugue state. She returned to the dressing room, sat through the Life magazine shoot, and smiled until her facial muscles spasmed. She let them drape her in furs and diamonds. Let the flashbulbs explode in her faces like miniature supernovas, blinding and violent. Every flash took a piece of her soul, converting it into a two-dimensional image to be sold at newsstands for 25 cents. But behind the smile, she was plotting. She was hoarding her pill allotment, not to take them, but to flush them. She was organizing her thoughts. When the studio finally quieted, the sprawling lot turning into a ghost town of shadowed sound stages and wandering security guards. She made her move. She dismissed her driver, claiming a migraine and a desire to sleep in her bungalow on the lot. As soon as the heavy sedan pulled away, she slipped out the back door. She wore a trench coat over her silk dress and a dark scarf wrapped around her platinum hair, extinguishing the beacon. She drove her own car, a black convertible with the top up, navigating the winding roads up into the Hollywood Hills. The rain had ceased, leaving a thick, clinging mist that obscured the city lights below. Los Angeles, usually the grid of electric ambition, looked soft, almost tender under the fog. It was a city of dreams, yes, but dreams were just nightmares with better lighting. The Griffith Observatory loomed above her, a white temple against the black sky. She parked in the shadows of the empty lot, the engine ticking as it cooled. Thorne was already there, leaning against the hood of a battered sedan, the ember of his cigarette glowing like a singular angry eye in the dark. He didn't move as she approached. He simply watched her, stripping away the layers of Marilyn with his gaze until he found the frightened, defiant woman beneath. You look like hell, Norma, he said quietly. He was the only one who used her real name without making it sound like an insult. I feel like a ghost, she replied, the breathy affectation gone. Her voice was lower, resonant with exhaustion. They're rewriting me, Elias, not just the scripts. Me. They're taking the parts of me that think, that feel, that hurt, and they're cutting them out. They're replacing them with giggles, with pratfalls. Thorne took a drag of his cigarette and flicked it into the wet grass. That's the deal, kid. You signed the paper. You sold the image. You can't lease the house and then complain about the furniture the tenants bring in. I didn't sell my mind. The sudden sharpness of her voice startled them both. It echoed off the concrete walls of the observatory. She reached into her coat and pulled out the notebook. I've been writing for years. Poems, observations, details about the meetings, the promises Vance made, the way they trade actresses like cattle, the names of the men who threaten to destroy us if we don't smile at the right parties. She held the book out to him. Her hand was steady now. This was the moment of revelation, the realization that her power didn't lie in her sexuality, but in her witness. She had been watching them just as closely as they watched her. Thorne stared at the book. He knew what it was. It was a grenade. If he took it, if he published even a fraction of what was likely inside, it wouldn't just be a scandal. It would be an indictment of the entire studio system. It would destroy her career. It might even destroy her life. Marilyn, he said, softness returning to his voice, if I write this, if we do this, there is no going back to the way it was. They will come for you. They will say you're crazy. They will say you're an addict. They will use every weapon they have to discredit you. Are you ready for that war? Marilyn looked past him, toward the city grid shimmering below. She saw the studio lot in the distance, a dark blotch on the landscape. She thought of the pink script pages. She thought of the pratfall. She thought of the girl in the mirror who was slowly suffocating under the weight of the mask. She realized then that the war had already started. She had been fighting it alone in silence for a decade. The only difference now was that she was about to hand someone else a gun. I don't want to go back, she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the terrifying thrill of liberation. I want to break the glass. I want them to see the blood. She stepped forward and pressed the notebook into his chest. Thorne hesitated for a heartbeat, looking into her eyes, searching for doubt. He found none. He took the book. It was heavy, dense with secrets. Okay, Thorne whispered. Okay, let's burn it down. Lightning flashed silently in the distance, illuminating the Hollywood sign on the adjacent hill. For a split second, the letters looked like tombstones. Marilyn pulled her coat tighter. She had crossed the line. The revelation was no longer just hers. It was out in the world. And the world, she knew, did not forgive women who told the truth. The retaliation did not come with a scream. It arrived with a suffocating, bureaucratic silence. For 3 days after the meeting at the observatory, Marilyn existed in a state of suspended animation. She moved through the world like a diver holding her breath, waiting for the surface to break, waiting for Elias Thorne's typewriter to shatter the glass ceiling of the industry. She imagined the headlines. She imagined the shock on Arthur Vance's face. She imagined for the first time walking onto a set without the invisible weight of the studio's hand on her throat. But the phone in her hallway remained mute. The newspapers landed on her doorstep with a dull thud, carrying nothing but the usual sanitized gossip. Studio mergers, premiere dates, and the manufactured romances of starlets who hadn't yet learned to weep. On the fourth morning, a summons arrived. It wasn't a call sheet, it was a memo delivered by a courier who refused to look her in the eye. Executive office, 9:00 a.m., private. The studio lot looked different that morning. The fog had lifted, leaving the sunlight hard and exposing. As Marilyn walked toward the administration building, a towering monolith of white concrete that housed the men who owned her name, she felt the gaze of the lot security guards. They weren't looking at her with the usual mix of lust and awe. They were looking at her with something colder. Pity. She took the elevator up to the top floor. The air conditioning hummed, a low, artificial drone that seemed to suck the moisture out of her skin. The hallway to Vance's office was long and lined with posters of her own face, Marilyn laughing, Marilyn winking, Marilyn selling soda, Marilyn selling sex. It was a hall of mirrors, and she was the ghost haunting it. When she entered the office, Arthur Vance was not alone. Sitting in the corner, shrouded in shadow and cigarette smoke, was a man she didn't recognize. A lawyer, perhaps. or a doctor, someone whose job was to clean up messes. But it was what lay on the center of Vance's mahogany desk that made her heart stop. It was the notebook, her leather-bound confession, the grenade she had pulled the pin on. It sat there closed, looking small and pathetic against the expanse of polished wood. Vance didn't stand up. He didn't offer her a drink. He simply rested his hand on the cover of the book, his fingers splayed possessively over the leather. "Did you really think," Vance began, his voice terrifyingly conversational, "that there is a single printing press in this city that I don't own? Did you think there is a writer, even a sewer rat like Thorne, who doesn't have a price?" Marilyn felt the floor tilt. The betrayal wasn't that Thorne had sold her out. It was that the system was so vast, so all-consuming, that resistance was mathematically impossible. Thorne hadn't just given them the book. The machine had simply absorbed him. "He promised," she whispered. The words sounded childish in the cold room. "He said he wanted the truth." "We all want the truth, darling," Vance said, flipping the book open. He scanned a page, his lips curling in a faint, mocking smile. "But this isn't truth. This is pathology." He looked up at her, his eyes devoid of empathy. "Listen to this. I am a product on a shelf screaming, but the packaging is too thick for anyone to hear." "That's not a memoir, Marilyn. That's a symptom." The man in the corner shifted. "Paranoia," he murmured. "Persecution complex. Classic signs of exhaustion." "No," Marilyn said, stepping forward. Her legs felt weak, but a fire was burning in her chest, the last embers of the rebellion. "Those are my feelings. Those are my experiences. You cut my lines. You drug me to sleep. You drug me to wake up. You sell pictures of my body to magazines I have never heard of. I have a right to say that it hurts." Vance slammed the book shut. The sound was like a gunshot. "You have no rights," he roared, the facade of calm shattering. "You are an investment. Do you have any idea how much money we have poured into the Marilyn Monroe? The hair, the teeth, the walk, the voice. We built you. Norma Jean was a factory worker with a stutter. We gave you the world." He stood up and walked around the desk, looming to fear her. The smell of his stale cigar smoke made her nauseous. "And now, because you're tired, because you're having a little existential crisis, you want to burn down the factory? You want to tell the public that the dream is a nightmare?" He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a hiss. "If this gets out, if one word of this gets out, we don't just fire you, we bury you. We will paint you as a lunatic, an addict, a danger to yourself. We will have you committed so fast your feet won't touch the ground. And the public, they won't believe you. They'll believe the tragedy we write for you." Marilyn backed away until her spine hit the doorframe. She looked at the notebook, her soul, captured in ink, now held hostage by the very man she tried to escape. She realized with a crushing clarity that she had handed them the weapon they needed to destroy her. Her honesty was now evidence of her insanity. "Please," she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow terror. "Just give it back." "No," Vance said, sliding the book into his desk drawer and locking it. The click of the lock echoed in the silence. "This stays here, for safekeeping. And you're going to take a vacation. A long one. Dr. Arkin here has arranged a suite for you at a very private clinic. You're going to rest. You're going to forget about writing. And when you come back, you're going to be the girl we paid for." The man in the corner stood up and approached her, his hands clasped, his face a mask of professional concern. "It's for the best, my dear. You're clearly unwell." Marilyn looked from the doctor to Vance, then to the locked drawer. The walls of the office seemed to be closing in, the air thinning. The realization hit her like a physical blow. There was no escape. The trap was perfect. If she fought, she was crazy. If she submitted, she was erased. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. The collapse was internal. It was the sound of a structural beam snapping deep within the soul. Her shoulders slumped. The light in her eyes, that fierce, defiant spark she had carried to the observatory, flickered and went out. She felt herself dissociating, floating up out of her body, leaving the woman in the trench coat behind to deal with the wolves. Okay, she said. The word was empty, a surrender flag raised over a conquered city. I'm tired. I just want to sleep. Vance smiled, satisfied. He had won. The product was back on the shelf. Good girl, he said. The car is waiting downstairs. Marilyn turned and walked out of the office. She walked down the hall of mirrors, past the images of her own smiling face. She didn't recognize them anymore. They belonged to the studio. They belonged to the public. As she stepped into the elevator and the doors slid shut, sealing her in, she closed her eyes. The darkness was a relief. In the dark, nobody could see her. In the dark, she didn't have to be Marilyn. She was just a woman falling endlessly into a silence she had finally stopped trying to break. Time in Hollywood is not measured in years, but in the degradation of film stock and the fading of beauty. The vacation the studio enforced turned into a hiatus, and the hiatus turned into a slow, jagged return to a world that had shifted beneath Marilyn's feet. She came back, but the porcelain doll who had sat in the makeup chair in part one was gone. In her place was a woman whose skin seemed thinner, almost translucent, as if the light she had swallowed for a decade was finally beginning to burn its way out. Arthur Vance sat in his executive office, the same room where the capitulation had happened 3 years prior. The air was thick with the smoke of a different cigar, but the silence was the same. On the desk before him lay a stack of daily rushes, footage from Marilyn's final picture. It was supposed to be another romp, another technicolor confectus of giggles and accidental innuendos. But as the projector whirred to life, casting a flickering beam of dust motes against the screen, Vance saw something that made the blood rain from his face. On the screen, Marilyn was standing in a garden, holding a bouquet of roses. The script called for her to smell them, look wistfully at the moon, and sigh. It was a throwaway moment, but Marilyn wasn't acting. She was channeling. She held the flowers like they were dead things. Her eyes, magnified 10 feet high on the wall, didn't look at the moon. They looked directly into the lens. They looked at Vance. The expression wasn't the vacant joy he had paid for, nor was it the hysterical sadness he had diagnosed. It was a terrifying, abyssal knowing. It was a look that said, I know what you did, and now I am going to make the whole world feel it. Vance stopped the projector. The image froze. Marilyn's haunting, accusatory stare burned into the canvas. He unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk. The leather-bound notebook was still there, buried under contracts and non-disclosure agreements. He hadn't touched it since the day he took it from her. He pulled it out, the leather now cold and stiff. He had thought that by locking away her words, he could lock away her truth. He had thought that by controlling the script, he could control the narrative. But as he looked back at the frozen image on the screen, he realized the magnitude of his error. He had taken her voice, yes. He had burned her manifesto, but he had failed to understand the medium he worked in. Marilyn would be didn't need a notebook to write her memoir. Her body was the paper. Her eyes were the ink. She had struck back in the only way an image can strike back against its creator. She had ceased to be a fantasy and had become a mirror. Every time the audience looked at her now, they didn't see the sex symbol they wanted. They saw the tragedy they had created. She had forced the public to become voyeurs to her slow disintegration, making them complicit in the theft of her soul. She hadn't screamed the truth. She had lived it, publicly, painfully, denying them the comfort of the illusion. In the final scene of the film, the character was supposed to walk off into the sunset with a jaunty wave. Instead, Marilyn had walked away with her head down, her shoulders heavy, disappearing into the shadows of the sounds. Stage before the director called cut. They kept it in. They had to. It was the only honest thing in the entire picture. Vance opened the notebook to the last page she had written. The ink faded but legible. If I am to be a product, she had written, then I will be the one who sets the price. He realized then what the price was. She had charged them her life, and in exchange she had left them with a ghost that would never leave this town. The studio could own the negatives, but they could never own the silence she left behind. Months later, the news broke not with a roar, but with a whisper that traveled down the telephone wires of Los Angeles like a tremor. The siren had stopped singing. The lights in the bungalow had gone out. The world wept for the icon, mourning the bland phantom they had projected their desires onto. But in the back offices, in the projection rooms, and in the quiet corners of the studio lot, the men who had built the machine sat in uneasy silence. They knew the truth. They knew that the tragedy wasn't an accident, it was a rebellion. Vance stood at his window, looking out over the lot. The rain had returned, washing the grime off the fake facades of the New York street set. He looked at his reflection in the glass, superimposed over the studio he ruled. He looked old. He looked small. He turned back to the desk, picked up the notebook, and held it over the wastebasket. He struck a match. He watched the flame curl the edges of the paper, watching the words turn to ash. Loneliness, betrayal, fear. The fire consumed it all, erasing the evidence of Norma Jean's mind. But when the last ember died, he looked up at the poster on his wall. Marilyn laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes tight with a secret pain. The book was gone, but the story was already told. It was etched into the celluloid, burned into the retina of the 20th century. She had broken the glass. She had shown them the blood. And even now, in the silence of the aftermath, the world couldn't look away.